This week, Anuj Soni, principal threat researcher at BlackBerry, joins us to discuss recent malware trends. In the security news, no Flipper Zero for you. Your glibc is hanging out in other loony tunables, and it's vulnerable for no other reason other than the obvious ones. A Russian firm will pay $20 million for Android or iPhone 0 days. You do what you do, and other exim vulnerability stories. Yet another way to become root on Linux. If you ever wanted to read the source code for Sub 7, well, now you can. More people want to trash bug bounties, and they're wrong. Curl has something coming, and it's not good. Tricking AI with your dead grandma's locket, GPU drivers could lead to something, and it's probably not good, depending on who you are. And the path to the cloud is filled with holes. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. SOC analysts are often overworked and underappreciated. In fact, many consider leaving their jobs or changing careers altogether. Devo is hosting the third annual SOC Analyst Appreciation Day to pay some long overdue kudos to analysts and encourage organizations to improve their job satisfaction and mental well-being. Join Devo and other cybersecurity industry professionals on October 18th for sessions and panels focused on de-stressing, SOC career development, and more. Visit securityweekly.com/Devo to register.
And welcome to the show. Hey, did you know today is National Taco Day? It is. Let me introduce you to a man who ate a couple of tacos today. Don't tell his wife, Mr. Paul Asadoria.
Coming to you in super low definition, compliments of Darth Vader himself. This is Paul's Security Weekly, episode number 801, being recorded on October 4th, 2023, right here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. I would just like to start the show with my Hackers movie t-shirt as an ode to Rob Graham and Josh Corman, because Hackers is the best hacker movie. To my left, Mr. Larry Pesce.
How's it going? And if you had told me you were going to wear that shirt, I would have worn my War Game shirt today.
And I would have had to tell you how Hackers is the best hacker movie.
And I would have disagreed.
I mean, it literally created the phrase hack the planet, which has been ingrained in our culture ever since. Mr. Tyler Robinson is here with us. Tyler, welcome to the show.
This is only a sneak preview of this ongoing, I don't even know what to call it at this point.
It's really just an extended troll, is what it is, Tyler. I mean, let's just call it what it is.
But it's not a troll if it's true, though.
This is true. So maybe it's not a troll. Dave
Those
Maynard
flat earthers
said it was too early to troll. I'm like, when is there a bad time to troll?
I don't know.
I thought that was an appropriate trolling response. Mr. Sam Bound is here with us. Sam, welcome.
Good evening. I've never seen Hackers.
Well, that's...
I mean, it's because it's not really a good movie.
That's you're missing out. It's your own fault.
I never had the feeling.
Burn. Oh, what's that, Sam? Sorry, you're breaking up. Mr. Josh Marpet is here with us. Josh, welcome.
Oh, you're an ass. Oh, I love it. Sam, I'm sorry, Sam. You can have time later. I apologize, sir. Go ahead.
It's like U.S. Congress in here.
Wow.
Wow.
And
I'll go pull the fire alarm.
Your time is up. Oh, boy. Well, it's good to have everyone. Let's see. The Cybersecurity Collaboration Forum is a one-stop shop for executive collaboration comprised of CISOs across various industries. They are celebrating the milestone of reaching over 1,000 members in their CISO community. If you want to be a part of the growing community of CISOs, join as a member or technology partner. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/cybersecurity collaboration. Anuj is a principal threat researcher, I should say, at BlackBerry, where he performs malware research and reverse engineering. He has more than 15 years of experience in malware analysis and incident response. Anuj is also a SANS Certified Instructor and author, where he is grateful for the opportunity to share his technical knowledge and practical skill set with his students. He is the author of SANS Forensics 710 Reverse Engineering Malware, Advanced Code Analysis, and the co-author of Forensics 610 Reverse Engineering Malware, Malware Analysis Tools and Techniques. Anuj, welcome to the show.
Hey, Paul. Hey, guys. Looking forward to hanging out tonight.
Yes, it's good to have you, Anuj. I want to start by asking you how you got your start in information security.
Yeah, sure. I'll try to keep this brief. Says probably everybody within talks for 15 minutes. But yeah, so as a malware reverse engineer, would love to say that I was reverse engineering cheat codes for Wolfenstein 3D when I was 10 years old. But unfortunately, that was not the case. My story's probably a little bit more traditional, a little bit more boring. But essentially, I was always interested in computers. That was a thing you could say, at least when I was a teenager. Now I think everybody's into computers. But I knew that I wanted to do something with computers. I wasn't exactly sure what. So when I went to college, I chose kind of a flexible major, went with information systems, right, which on its own means absolutely nothing. But I knew I didn't want to necessarily dive into programming with CS or engineering with computer engineering. So it seemed like a safe way to kind of figure out where I would fit in. And towards the end of my kind of undergraduate education, I had to choose essentially a focus, a specialty as part of the program. And we had 4 options. I can't remember what the other 3 were, but one of them was information security, right? And so at the time, like many people in the early 2000s, I was getting a lot of my technical news from Slashdot. And I noticed there was definitely kind of a growing number of security-related news items. And I think like a lot of young kids, and when I say young, I mean like 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, right? We all have this dream, maybe some as adults, of being superhero investigators. And I was reading these stories and thinking, well, I didn't think my career as being a superhero was gonna turn out as I had imagined as a kid. But perhaps this was a way to kind of blend my interest in computers with an investigative aspect to the work. So I decided to go with information security and had the privilege of taking some really impressive classes at my university that were literally taught by some of the fantastic people at Foundstone, one of the OG cybersecurity consulting firms. They would come every other weekend rather, and teach classes like Hacking Exposed and Incident Response. And some of those words sound familiar based on those books that are now in their like 10th edition. It's because those were actually my textbooks, like the books written by George Kurtz, the founder of CrowdStrike, and Stuart McClure, who would later go on to found Silence, which I would join in 2016. Those were my textbooks. And so that was my first kind of exposure to practical security, right? Because in the university setting, a lot of it gets a bit too theoretical. So I decided to kind of continue and progress and just follow my curiosity. Ended up getting an internship at the NSA out of college, and then did some government contracting. Worked for over a decade for Booz Allen Hamilton, which if you're in the DC area is like a rite of passage. And as part of that decade, I got exposed to all sorts of things like vulnerability assessments, pen testing, incident response, and had an opportunity to join a hunt team for a government client. So we were part of a kind of a proactive effort to look for evidence of unusual or malicious activity. We literally had an in-house tool. It was a batch file on Windows that would be deployed to all the endpoints, and would use a combination of command line tools built into Windows and sysinternals tools, and just collect all this information about running processes and registry keys and directory listings. And it would literally FTP that to a server. And we would collect that every day and do some very basic statistical analysis to look for anomalies. And so that's how I got my first exposure to real malware in like an actual enterprise environment. And I thankfully had the opportunity to dig into these files, even though I had like zero background at the time in actually performing malware analysis. I just kind of, again, followed my curiosity and kept doing research online. And for a couple of years, just had an opportunity to learn on my own. And later on in 2016, I had an opportunity to basically be a full-time reverse engineer, which was a dream of mine for Cylance. And 2019, we got acquired by BlackBerry. So now I work for BlackBerry. And yeah, that basically brings us to today.
That FTP server, Anuj, was it a WS FTP server? I'm just joking. You don't have to answer that.
At one point, it probably was.
Probably, right? I mean, that was big back in the day. Very nostalgic.
Oh, yeah.
Save it for the news.
That's a great story. But Anuj, what were some of the early influences in your career? Was there a particular book or person that influenced you early in your career?
I mean, there certainly were people that influenced me. I don't know, in terms of people anyone who's listening to this might know, Certainly, you mentioned I'm a SANS instructor. So earlier on, I literally was a SANS student, and as many of us instructors and authors are, and I took Lenny Zelchers' reverse engineering malware class. And so, he definitely influenced me. He continues to influence me. I consider him a mentor. And, he's just so nice to talk to. And in terms of career opportunities, just talking to him about what the potentials were from someone who took a class like that. He was very generous with his time and with his guidance. So, and just a lot of people along the way earlier on in my career who just happened to kind of put me in these positions. For example, when I joined a hunt team, I had no background in performing that work. And in fact, it was partially because I had a security clearance that allowed me to kind of get through those doors. But if it wasn't for that, I probably would have never had that extensive exposure to malware and the freedom to really look at those files that would have, that eventually got me here.
That's awesome. Yeah, I love Lenny. He's a great guy.
For sure.
So in your job today, Anuj, what are you seeing? Where do we want to start? Do we want to talk about like what inside the malware that you're seeing? Inside of it, is there some new trends that you're seeing when you do the reverse engineering looking at it?
Yeah, so for some context, just so people understand kind of what I do on a regular basis, I'm part of the threat research and operations team. So, at a vendor like BlackBerry that produces an antivirus product, right, there are usually many reverse engineers, and reverse engineering, that skill set, is used for a variety of purposes.
Yeah.
So in my job, I use it in order to really do two things. One, I support our incident response team. So if they, while they're performing IR engagements, if they find something of interest that they don't have enough time to really dig into, then they'll go ahead and pass it to someone like me on our team. And two, I support customer requests. So customers can send in files and say, hey, I don't know what this is. Can you provide me some information? Or they could submit a false positive request, right? If they think that it was incorrectly identified as malware, or false negative if we missed something. So those are kind of the types of analysis that I perform. So in terms of what I actually see, and I wanted to couch it because, obviously there's all, compared to like 10 years ago, right? I mean, there's malware, interesting malware each and every day. And while I would love to say I've been exposed to all of it, I haven't. So I get exposed to, typically in a Windows environment, what our customers are seeing. My background is primarily in Windows malware analysis. So if you throw a Maco sample at me, I'll probably break into a cold sweat. But given that context, any reverse engineer, right, probably spends 70% of their time looking at Cobalt strike beacons. And I don't mean just like the beacon itself, but there are so many ways that, so many combinations of loaders and technologies that result in Cobalt strike being deployed into an enterprise environment. A large portion of my time basically results in those beacons. But certainly, considering the past couple of years, I'd say that one trend that is very clear, right? This is not a prediction. I don't do predictions.
Yeah.
But something that I think all reverse engineers would agree with is that there's a growing number of just multi-technology samples. And what I mean by that is it's not just like this C++ binary that's just loading some shellcode in memory or decrypting another C++, .exe or DLL, but we're talking about multi-platform technologies like Golang and Rust, and many times there's like a combination of all those technologies that are being deployed as part of a particular attack chain, and each of those kind of has a bit of a learning curve, right? If you're trying to understand how a Golang executable works, while the process is roughly the same as a C++ executable, there's certain things you need to understand about the structure of a file of a .exe that was coded in Golang versus in Rust. And so, that's something I'm definitely seeing more and more. And, as a reverse engineer, even though I've been doing this, full time since probably 2014, I'm always learning. So I'm always getting exposed to these different technologies. I just recently only started digging into Rust because up until recently, I haven't seen many Rust samples, but I just saw like a Rust loader that was loading a sliver implant. And so, it was a bit of a shift away from the typical Cobalt strike, which I normally see. So that was a little bit different. But yeah, seeing a lot of Golang binaries as well. And just seeing attackers be creative in the combination of these technologies, right? Throwing .NET in there in addition to shellcode in order to kind of gain execution in the hope that maybe you're, hooking one of these technologies or analyzing one of them, but not all of them, right? That might be deployed as part of a particular attack chain.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to be as close to an expert as you can in each of these languages, right? Which is really, It's really hard and also difficult because you don't have a whole lot of historical reference to fall back on. For example, when we look at a Linux vulnerability, I'll use vulnerability because Linux malware is usually like not, I mean, there is Linux malware out there, right? But it's all mostly written in C. And we have like this huge library of C examples and explanations that have been put together since the 70s when C was created, right? We don't have that background for a lot of these newer languages such as Rust or Go.
Right. Yeah. So we're really kind of building this knowledge base as we go. And when you talk about even other architectures like Maco or Linux, I mean, even though Linux malware has been around for a little while, I mean, the tools, the platforms, the automation capabilities available are just like next to nothing. You have literally a handful of things that you can even use. So obviously, lots of interesting opportunity for research. But particularly for new analysts, it's really just, I mean, it's hard to get started because you have to immediately spend quite a few hours on learning these technologies and these different architectures.
I'm assuming most of what you're seeing is also from an architectural standpoint, x86. You mentioned Linux, right? And it runs on 8 million different platforms. And that makes reverse engineering all that more challenging. But most of what you're dealing with in news is I venture to guess, like Windows x86.
It's probably, I mean, the balance has certainly shifted and continues to shift. I mean, there's a lot of 64-bit at this point, certainly compared to 5 years ago. Like 5 years ago, I'd say 90% of it that I would see was x86. Now it's getting closer to kind of a even split, I'd say, in terms of looking at x64.
Nice. But it's usually not ARM or anything like that.
No, I mean, I've literally never had to look as part of my job like ARM malware.
It's not because we're not looking at
malware
the US
have
malware,
you looked at?
right?
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Tyler.
No, I was just saying a lot of the ARM stuff we're seeing on the firewalls and switches and endpoints are intelligence agencies of the Western nature. So I would say that typically doesn't end up in a lot of people's desks, but we're starting to see a lot of that with the VMware, a lot of the second gate stuff, the analysis we're seeing secondhand through the IC. There's quite a bit of the ARM stuff coming down the platforms, or there's not great visibility there, so you're going to see a lot less of it. But when you do see it, do pay attention because it is pretty important.
I guess where I was going with that too, Anuj, was what do you recommend people learn if they want to get into reverse engineering malware? I'm assuming, like where I was trying to see if you had some recommendations, like do you learn x86 assembly, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so certainly I would, and granted I'm biased here, right? But I would focus on Windows just because there's more samples to review, there's more tools to use, there's more resources that are already written, right? More videos on YouTube that have already been created. So I definitely focus on Windows and using x86 as a starting point. I agree is not a bad idea because in terms of the leap from x86 to x64, Windows malware, it's very small. Yeah. It's like once you understand x86 assembly, it's just, once you get good at a programming language, learning another one isn't too challenging. And, most people find it to be quite similar, right? You're not talking about months and months of a learning curve. You're talking about, days maybe, once you have a solid understanding of x86. So, I think that's a perfectly good strategy to kind of employ.
And then like Windows kernel stuff too. What's the Windows kernel book? There's a book on the Windows kernel.
The rootkit book?
Yeah, something like I feel like Recenovich wrote one. There's also Windows, go ahead, Sam.
Windows internals, right?
Yes, Windows internals. Thank you. Was that Recenovich, Windows internals? Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah, that's a great book. I mean, in terms of actual kernel malware, I mean, understanding how to take a look at kernel malware is still, I mean, as part of my job, I very rarely, if ever, look at kernel malware. I can't even remember the last time I had to. So, I mean, I think the more likely application of an understanding of how to do kernel level analysis these days is in the attack chains that involve vulnerable drivers, right? That's certainly happening quite a bit. But, certainly sophisticated threat actors do deploy malicious drivers. It's just, certainly if you're just getting started, especially if you're getting started, it's just so rare. I'd say there's almost no point in really even taking a look at those. But, I think later down, years into a career in reverse engineering, if the need's there, sure. But as we all know, Microsoft's kind of locked down successfully in some ways. I think the ability to create malicious kernel drivers and at least increased the level of effort. And so it's just something that even I don't see very often.
That's interesting. So, but what you're seeing is newer languages, the malware being coded in newer languages, and people are just still using Cobalt Strike. Like this, we're not talking about anything like extraordinary in terms of the effort or uniqueness, right? Or it's not shiny new hot. It's, writing malware in .NET and Go and Rust and Cobalt Strike.
Yeah, I mean, in most cases, and of course, this is my opinion, but it doesn't make sense to necessarily create a custom piece of malware. What makes more sense is maybe to create some custom obfuscation. But the actual underlying code doesn't have to be anything different than the, tons of open source and closed source red team tools that are already out there or cracked that people can get access to.
What's your worst nightmare?
My worst nightmare in terms of
malware to come up against, I suppose.
Because that's a really open-ended question.
Yeah, you had to qualify that. Like, clowns is an acceptable answer to that.
That's Dave Kennedy.
That's Dave Kennedy's. Yes.
I mean, the thing is, it's since my job is to reverse engineer malware, and I'm not doing incident response on these networks. I'm not like the stakeholder on these networks.
Valid. But like, what's the nastiest malware you've come up against? What would be something that a malware writer could do that would just make you, curse your job choices or whatever,
Oh, I mean, that's kind of what we're just talking about. I think kernel level malware it can be very challenging to look at. And a lot of the typical tools don't work in those cases. Yeah. I mean, it's, you just got to spend a lot more time in WinDebug, which I prefer not to. So, I mean, that would not be much fun. But again, it's like even if I were to see the most challenging sample I've ever encountered might be, I mean, for me, given my job and given the fact that it's my job and I have the time, therefore, to actually dig into this stuff, I would love it. If something was incredibly challenging. I mean, for me, there's no better days than just looking at code all day long and having the time to do so, right? I can't doing so in like a stressed out environment. It might be a little bit challenging, but I'm not a golfer, but suddenly this metaphor comes to mind. I don't know if anyone here golfs, but I would imagine that the best day or the best week or the best year for a golfer, if they didn't have to worry about money or anything else, is just to kind of go out and golf all day, every day, and just get a little better. And that's kind of how I see my ideal, career, my ideal job when it comes to malware analysis. I just want to do it every day and learn a little bit every day and not be super stressed out about a particular result, but just kind of do research alongside and learn what I need to in order to successfully tear something apart.
I like it. Oftentimes, reverse engineering isn't the sole thing, like it's a means to an end in a much longer kind of project that I'm working on. So I take what I have and I upload it to VirusTotal. Now, I'm assuming I know there's a lot better tools and techniques. So what advice do you have for folks that want to dig in and learn some of these techniques for pulling apart, specifically malware, right? Because there's reverse engineering to find vulnerabilities, but we're reverse engineering malware with a slightly different, and yeah, we might find, vulnerabilities in it, which is interesting, but we're more just looking to see what it does rather than where it's vulnerable.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly looking at virus total output is a good start, right, to learn about what a sample does. But if you actually want to learn how to analyze malware, then, of course, you got to roll up your sleeves and do that work yourself. So, I mean, I think that in terms of someone getting started in this field, I mean, there are lots of books and resources out there, but that's not very specific guidance. So when people ask me, when like students in SANS classes ask me, I mean, my go-to, honestly, to this day is suggesting, and again, obviously, if they came through my class, hopefully they feel like they've learned some of this stuff. But if someone like were to just shoot me a DM and ask me how did they get started, my advice would generally be to pick up the Practical Malware Analysis book, right? Mm-hmm. It's been out for, a decade, maybe more. And yeah, some of the tools in there and the techniques are obviously of that time. And it could use some updating, but the approach in there and the way the book is laid out in terms of actually including labs along the way is a great way to get familiar with, at least the first few chapters in particular, a great way to get familiar with performing malware analysis. And I think that we live in a great day for malware analysts where there are so many tools and frameworks and open source scripts, so many options.
I want to stop right there, Anuj, because I want people to understand the fundamentals and do it the manual way, the hard way first, then take advantage of what you're about to say with like the plethora of tools and frameworks that we have to analyze this stuff, right? I feel like reverse engineering, especially whether it's firmware, because there are specific tools for that, but you should learn how to pull that stuff apart manually first so you get the fundamental knowledge. I think that's what Lenny also preaches when I speak with Lenny on the matter too. Like, you should know how to take stuff apart by hand. Then you can go implement these automated tools and understand what they're doing, what their shortcomings and or strengths might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even in the advanced course I teach, I try not to rely outside of the bare minimum, which is necessary, because I don't want people coding up their own disassembler during class. Outside of using some basic tools, I mean, I don't rely upon any third-party scripts or plugins, because I'd rather show people how to write the most basic script themselves than rely upon some script that's not going to be maintained tomorrow.
Right. Or it's probably not. A lot of times those third-party scripts too aren't tuned to exactly what you're doing. Right, like it was for some other kind of type binary or whatever, but it's not for your thing. So you better know how to write the script yourself. Otherwise, someone else's tool might not work for you.
Absolutely. But yeah, to your point about like the number of tools and capabilities out there, I mean, one of my main pieces of advice, at least initially, or even for people like me for a period of time, is to commit to a tool set, right? I think that people can spend so much time just trying to understand which tool to use, right? Like, do I use Ghidra? Do I use IDA? Do I use Binary Ninja? Radare? Lots of options out there. But like, if you spend all your time just trying to, right, it's like a research overload, right, which I know people in this field are really good at and love to do. But when it comes to improving a skill set, like, that's a distraction. You gotta just pick something. Pick a tool, a disassembler. Pick a static file analysis tool like PE Studio if you're doing Windows analysis. Pick a debugger. Just pick 3 or 4 tools and decide to stick with those tools as you actually start to dissect some malware. And that's kind of how you sharpen. Yeah.
I would have the same advice for firmware too. Like, pick stuff and probably not bin walk. I mean, okay, bin walk, but
yep, there's others.
There's others.
Pick something and learn your tool set so well that you can use it no matter what. But that raises a question. What's missing in the tool sets today?
What's missing in the tool sets today? I mean, certainly when it comes to other architectures, right, like Linux and Mac, there's definitely a lack of any sort of tools. And again, it should be on the community, the people doing the analysis, to try and create these tools, right? So you got to contribute, can't just complain. But certainly that is lacking. I mean, on the Windows side, I think there are more than enough tools, but likely too many tools. And so, the benefit there, though, is because all the bases have been covered, you can, in theory, spend your time, rather than worrying about, God, do I have to create this script or create this tool? You can actually work on some of the more creative aspects, right, like of automation. So, one popular thing I sometimes hear these days, even heard 5-10 years ago when people started buying more malware sandboxes, is, oh God, there's malware sandboxes now. Reverse engineers aren't needed anymore. And that's obviously not true, right? Sandboxes have been around for a long time, and reverse engineers are still in need. Now, yes, most organizations don't need a team of 10 reverse engineers, but there still is a need for this skill set, regardless of whatever products have been released, over the past few years. So I think that really, on the Windows side especially, it's really up to the community, right? It's up to individuals to start contributing, because the frameworks are spectacular, right? Even in terms of automation, like, you got dynamic binary instrumentation frameworks like Intel PIN and Frida. You have all sorts of emulation frameworks like Killing and Speakeasy. You got Anger for symbolic execution. Like, there's all these frameworks that are already built, but it takes time to even take that tool and learn to use it intelligently. And so that's, I think, where, when you've done reverse engineering for a number of years, like, that's where a lot of the effort should go, because the bases are already covered. In my opinion, most of the bases are covered. Sure, these tools could use improvement and need support, and should address bugs and other feature enhancements, but the basics are all there. And I think now is at least on the Windows side is really like an amazing time to not only get involved, but like free your mind up to kind of think more creatively about these problems and how to automate them.
Anuj, go ahead. Who was that, Josh?
I mean, I think the synopsis of what you said is that automation is the massively, not the missing piece, but it's the piece that is so very important. You mentioned automation at least a half a dozen times during this interview, and I find that fascinating. The workflow automation of from tool to tool, from evidence to evidence, from evidence to tool, et cetera, I think is hugely important. I agree with you, by the way. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I think it's important to know like what the automation might miss or misinterpret. right? And I think, Larry, we see that. If you dump firmware into something like Emba or Foca, is that the other one? There's like a number of different firmware
there's a bunch
frameworks.
now.
And you're like, oh, yeah, but like, I know where this firmware came from. And I know when I run it through this thing, it's not going to analyze that correctly. And I got to do that by hand. But you only know that if you've put the time in to do the manual stuff and put the time in to learn the framework or tool and then like compare and contrast between the two. And I think that's what makes you super effective is knowing how far that automation is going to get you.
Automation is awesome until it doesn't work.
Right.
Because then you need to figure out why the automation broke or why it didn't work. And a lot of that is manual process.
Right.
Knowing the manual process first, then you kill it with the automation.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, and when I say automation, so I'm talking about something as simple as a script or creating a YAR rule that can be plugged into a process. But you make a great point, right? The automation I see, using that kind of general term here, is an output as a critical output of reverse engineering. Because when I analyze a sample, I'm not just getting paid to spend 10 hours in a Ghidra interface. Like, what's my output? And sure, indicators of compromise are an output, a description of functionalities output. But the ideal output is, okay, if I see something similar to this again, how do I make sure it doesn't take me 10 hours next time? And so, that's the output that I think if reverse engineers, once they get the basics down, if they focus on, they will be invaluable, no matter what products are released, no matter what technologies come out. Because, to your point, you still need a human to create that automation, to validate that automation, and you still need to do the manual work first to even consider what has to be automated.
Yeah, you need to know what questions to ask. So I was doing this this week. It wasn't necessarily malware, but you have to know what questions to ask in terms of, like, wait, is that file system encrypted or not? Now, how would I answer that question? And one of my coworkers was like, wait, I'll be right back. And he comes back and he sends me a link to ChatGPT. And he's like, here's a script that analyzes files and analyzes their entropy and gives you a thing. And like, we iterated over it and ran this going like, oh, right, it's encrypted. And like, sure, could we have sat down and probably written that script? Yes. But we're like, I just want to answer the question. Like, is it encrypted or not? Like, I don't care what kind. I don't care. Like, I just need to answer this yes or no question.
You could use binwalk or ent, but...
I think I did binwalk and it wasn't helpful at all.
Ent, if the entire firmware was encrypted,
Ent, yes. I've heard of that before. Yes. Yep. Sorry, I don't think there's a question.
Reversing labs, and reversing labs just tears it apart regardless of encryption packer or language.
Right. There's that too. I don't think it's a question there. We're just talking.
No, but Paul, to your point, it depends what you're trying to answer, right? So if I'm looking at a sample and the question that the customer is asking me is, hey, I need to understand what domain, what domains, IP addresses might be in some sort of config data. Well, maybe that config data is encrypted with RC4, and maybe maybe in that moment I just need that information. Well, in that case, I don't even care what the algorithm is. I just need to get at the information. Maybe I can do that quickly in a debugger. Maybe I can run the program and just look in memory for indications of that config if I understand its format a little bit. But if the question is, all right, going beyond that, how do I detect similar malware in the future? Well, in that case, I might need to understand the algorithm because I might end up creating a YAR rule based on that algorithm, which might be fairly custom. So yeah, absolutely. It depends kind of what question you're asking and whether or not you need to go to that extent of creating the automation.
And I like how a lot of times where I think us as security engineers and researchers, we know how to take sometimes the shortest path. Sometimes. Like, here's not the shortest path. And like in your question, I'm like, well, if it's encrypted, but if really the data I want is where it's contacting, what domains and IP addresses, maybe I can just detonate that in a safe environment and sniff it and see where it's going. Then I don't have to reverse engineer anything, right? But I get the answer to my question, and that's the most important thing.
Right. But I mean, I would say that if, let's say, you see that same sample that decrypts at runtime its config data, and maybe just detonating it in a sandbox got you that information, or just even in a VM, you just looked in memory and you found it. I think that could be great for that particular instance. But let's say you see this same type of malware,
then you got to dig
10 times over the next month. Exactly. And then you might want to create, I should probably create a script to go ahead and decrypt that. So I don't have to run it in a debugger or a sandbox every time. Right. But yeah, it kind of depends. Like in the moment when I'm assisting in IR, I just need to get at the information. So I don't really care how I get there. But when I have a few minutes afterwards, once things are kind of calm, the fire's, settling, then I might want to revisit it if it's something that's either super custom or just even super common that I need to be able to identify quickly and extract some information from.
I like this. It's kind of like a day in the life of a malware reverse engineer.
More like a month in the life, but yeah.
A month, yeah. This is true. But that's a great point, Anuj. This stuff takes time, and I think people underestimate. They think it's, like magic. Like, oh, I give a binary to Anuj, and Anuj spits back all the stuff it's doing. Like, it's great. It's magic. But it's not. It's a lot of work.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've been looking at this one BlackBite version 3 ransomware sample for 3 weeks, not 8 hours a day. Like I kind of it was part of an IR. I provided them the initial information they needed and they were fine with it, but I knew there was more to kind of dig into there. And so, every day I'll spend a couple hours on it and just kind of see what I can dig up. But yeah, these are very long efforts that often result in something that might look like it was determined rather quickly, but took a serious lift.
Are you seeing any other trends with malware, or in trends in general, like trends that malware, what it's doing or how it's doing it, or trends in reverse engineering tools or techniques that are really helping you? Either one.
I mean, there's probably some overlap with what we already discussed in terms of techniques. Without a doubt, it's all of the interesting frameworks that have come up in the past 5 years that can be used to kind of expedite the work through forms of scripts and automation. In terms of the actual malware itself, I mean, I think that, and I'm not going to pretend to say that any of it's easy. I mean, malware has certainly gotten more challenging, but it's gotten more challenging because of just the combination of techniques that are being used, right? So not only are we talking about multiple technologies in terms of Golang and Rust and shellcode and C++ code, auto IT scripts and all that, Python scripts all being thrown together into a particular attack. But where was I going with this? But I think we're also talking about just like certainly the level of effort in terms of tearing that apart. And I think what's complicated and more, and this is less of the malware analysis specifically, but in terms of like incident response, which I'm sometimes get involved in as part of my reverse engineering effort, just the fact that there isn't always malware involved, I think is kind of interesting. And so, as a malware reverse engineer, my preference, of course, is that there always be malware involved because I want to dig into it.
Right.
But oftentimes what might have been, the first stage or the next stage may be a built-in Windows tool.
Yeah.
And that's something that I kind of just have to be more open to these days than I think I had to really consider before. So not only are we talking about multi-stage execution of malware itself with multiple technologies, but of course you're throwing into this just tools, whether it's remote access tools or built-in Windows command line tools that are now being kind of paired with those technologies, just making it a big mess.
I feel like Linux malware falls in that same. I think I alluded to that earlier. There's not so much people developing their own code in the wild. Oftentimes it's just like a bunch of scripts. Like they have bash and they're just using it. So it's not really malware, right? They're living off the land.
Yeah, and the thing, I mean, even though I don't look at Linux malware too much, and my preference is Windows, if I had a choice in the matter. I mean, when you look at some of the Linux malware, even the Linux variants of Windows malware, it's just the mistakes that are sometimes made are just childish, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was it, Lockbit? I think it might have been Lockbit. Lockbit's been around the Windows side for a while, but the Linux variant of Lockbit just made when they developed it and made their choices about their encryption scheme, right? In terms of how are they going to protect or how are they were going to encrypt files on disk, and then how they were going to protect the per key encryption keys or the per file encryption keys. I think they did something really silly. Like they had an embedded RC4 key that was used to encrypt every file on disk, and then they encrypted it with another embedded RC4 key or something of that sort, such that you could literally look at the binding and just pull out the key to decrypt the per file keys. So you could decrypt all the files, right? But on the Windows side, there was no such issue. So I think attackers are also, right, a little wary of producing non-Windows binaries because it's just, things are just less tried and tested and there's more likely to be mistakes. A common question that we'll get from customers when there's ransomware is, can we decrypt it? Can we decrypt it? And 9 times out of 10 or 99% of the time, especially when you're talking about Windows, the answer is no. Like this has been around for a while. Ransomware in Windows has been around for a while. And you'd have to do something really terrible to jeopardize that. I mean, there are so many tried and tested algorithms and the actual approach is just so well documented at this point. But on Linux, that's not the case. So on Linux, there's a chance that you can decrypt all the files, which is kind of cool. So that's kind of a benefit, I guess, of kind of stepping into the waters of more Linux malware analysis, I think.
Anuj, Josh brought up a great question in a meeting we had yesterday. And the center of this question is around privilege level. What privilege level do attackers need to, want to, have to go to in order to be successful? We'll limit this to Windows environments. Is it a case where the user is already local admin and that's enough for them? If it's a case the user is not local admin, are they escalating? Do you see that inside the malware, these techniques to escalate privileges either locally or within the domain?
I mean, most recently, it's in the context of what we talked about before, the bring your own vulnerable driver, like the BlackBerry version 3 ransomware that I was just telling you about, that I've been kind of periodically looking at, that has 2 vulnerable drivers packaged in with it.
Yep.
That could be used for escalation, but to encrypt the files on disk, it doesn't need that.
Yep. Okay.
That's more of just an option for attackers.
Mm-hmm.
And because everything's kind of in memory, as long as you can execute the initial loader, which doesn't require escalated privileges usually, let's take the Cobalt Strike Beacon example. I mean, it's going to unravel that in memory. It's going to only be in memory, and that can provide the attacker the access they need. So, while certainly there are attacks that involve exploits, it's certainly not, something I see. I say a small fraction of the samples that I analyze actually involve exploits.
Yeah. So what that's interesting is that the attackers, to accomplish their goals, they don't necessarily need to escalate privilege and or create advanced persistence on the device. Most of the attacks you see are likely ransomware, and they don't need to go through all that work or effort. They can accomplish their goals of encrypting stuff without escalating privileges.
Yeah, I mean, ransomware in particular, I think the bar is so low because they're just trash in the box, right? They're not really they don't need anything super secret and persistence and all this stuff. I mean, they're just like setting your box on fire. So that case in particular, I think, but yeah, I mean, in terms of persistence, I mean, user run keys, right? That's been around for decades. You don't need any sort of escalated privileges for that. So there's nothing advanced about it. Now, again, obviously there are certain attackers who want that escalated privileges, but there's a lot of malware. The majority of malware doesn't need it.
That's interesting. Do you think as defenses, if we improve defenses, we're in this kind of game where attackers are going to start increasing their capabilities in terms of escalating privilege and persisting?
Maybe, but I think that obviously I work for a security vendor, right? Mm-hmm. But and our ultimate goal would be to ensure no malicious execution on a box. That's what the Silence, that's what the company was. That's what any AV company, right? That's their goal. But we haven't achieved it, right? Nobody has. So I think even in this current playing field, there's enough room to move around that, maybe certainly for a sophisticated adversary targeting a sophisticated organization, they might need to go to that extent. Mm-hmm. But for most malware that's trying to steal information from a browser or even from a local system, that's just trying to provide command and control over that victim machine, there's just no need. So I think attackers will always rise to the occasion. And right now, it just generally hasn't been required for most target organizations.
What's the level of stealth and cleaning up after itself that most malware that you see has today, Anuj?
I mean, the thing is, there isn't a whole lot of, so certainly just deleting itself, right, is something that even, ransomware often does. But because everything and the vast majority of operations are happening in memory in many cases, there's really nothing to clean up. I mean, because these days, how often is a memory dump performed in close proximity to the actual attack? Maybe in some organizations, but generally that's not often the case. And in terms of the information that could be revealed in memory, whether it's config data or other IOCs, I mean, all that can be decoded as needed. And that's pretty easy to clean up in terms of just kind of freeing the memory, overwriting the memory during execution. So, I mean, it's not something that I've seen in terms of cleanup. I haven't seen any drastic improvements in cleanup. Certainly there have been improvements in evasion techniques, right? Yeah. A combination of evasion techniques. But in terms of the cleanup itself, because we're talking memory and most people don't get to the actual, site of the incident, the actual machine, before the memory's already kind of been garbled up and has become, virtually useless. I haven't seen any changes there, at least based on my experience.
That's interesting. So since we're largely dealing with in-memory kind of stuff, majority of what you see, right? Some of these concerns aren't really applicable because they're just doing what they need to do in memory, and then that's the kind of the end of it. They've accomplished their goals.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, in the context of like ransomware, they need to make sure that the keys that are being used to encrypt and the, any keys that are dynamically generated during execution, the public-private key pair, that all of that is cleaned up after. And so, pretty much all Windows ransomware does that today. But beyond that, they don't need to worry about cleaning like large chunks of memory. It's usually like small bytes, right? Whether it's a key, an encryption key, or a particular string. Just to make it a little bit more challenging to grab that stuff from memory. But yeah, I'd say that's not a challenge that I've encountered very often.
More questions for Anuj? Did you guys have other questions? Josh?
Yeah, it helps if I come off mute. Jesus. You've talked about things that are problematic. You've talked about directions you want your daily life, and it's good stuff. What do you think is coming down the pike? What's the future?
Is there an answer question somewhere here? Well, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. What was the last part?
Predict. What do you think is going to happen in a year from now? How much AI malware is going to make your life miserable? There's a million questions. Pick one.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think there's a lot of room to make things more custom, right? There have been cases of custom file formats being used for some malware, and obviously, initial loader has to be, if you're targeting an operating system, has to run on that that operating system. I think that there's opportunity for custom packers, but again, there's risks associated with all this custom stuff because it could break, could not work. But when you're dealing with sophisticated adversaries, they arguably have the resources to kind of engage in that. And so, when you think about some of the most sophisticated packers out there, like Thamida, right, that's been around for ages by, I think, Orion Software. And, the way that Thamida works is it's literally creating a virtual machine, a micro VM during execution. And so even if you're able to analyze the code associated with individual instructions of that malware, it is a custom instruction set. So you actually have to define the custom instruction set before you can even start to understand the code.
Wow,
so, I could see, so I mean, if that were to be more prevalent, that would certainly be a problem in terms of understanding the internals of how a program works. But more and more malware also going back to evasion, right? I mean, that's a very sophisticated form of analysis evasion, of course, because it's going to run just fine. But in terms of analyzing it, that's where the challenge comes in. But like going back to this BlackBerry ransomware that I was recently looking at, I literally couldn't debug it. I mean, it had so many anti-analysis and anti-debugging and evasion techniques employed that like it wasn't working. I spent hours trying to debug it, and you try to like fake it out here and there, but it wasn't working. So I had to literally stop using my debugger. And thankfully, I have a little bit of background in using some other frameworks like Frida. And so I had to turn to Frida, which when it attaches to a running process, it doesn't look like a traditional debugger. And so it's able to allow the malware to execute. Now, it's a much more painful process to get the same information. I can't, execute individual instructions. I have to have the knowledge of some static code analysis up front, which I did put the time into understanding. But that drastically complicates my analysis, right? I mean, if I can just debug and set breakpoints, I mean, in many cases, a few hours, you could understand 60, 70% of the sample. But because they had all these capabilities built in, which I would have to have one by one disabled, essentially, it literally, prevented me from using my typical tool set, which is a debugger, in order to kind of unearth the underlying information. So I think that'll probably continue to happen because it was effective. I mean, it was effective at least against me, and I'm not like, the best RE out there, but I think that it's that sort of situation. Those evasion techniques are only going to continue, and there'll be just, different combinations of them will exist, and it'll prevent people from using typical tool sets. It'll evade sandboxes. And at some point when these other tools, these frameworks become more popular, it'll evade those too. Right. And that puts you in a really tough position where you're purely relying upon static code analysis, which is incredibly time consuming.
Is that becoming more commonplace, Anuj, these analysis techniques?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've been around the technique. Yeah, they've been around. I mean, if you consider something super simple like the API is debugger present, right? I mean, that's been around for decades. But I think that there are a great resource for this, by the way, is Unprotect. If you haven't heard of the Unprotect project, it's by Thomas Rockia. I might be mispronouncing his last name, but he's a security engineer at Microsoft. He created the Unprotect project, which is just purely focused on detailing all potential evasion techniques in malware. And so you'll see the list there. There's hundreds of them, and some of them have been around for decades. Some are from more recent years. And I do think that malware will start using more and more of those. I mean, they already are using many of those techniques, and that really does get in the way, because when you prevent an analyst from using their most basic, bare minimum tools, I mean, that's pretty problematic. And I think, as analysts, we have to step up and find ways to overcome that. But I think that, but yeah, in terms of trends, I do think that will continue in combination with multi-technology malware.
Anuj, what's your favorite rye whiskey?
Oh, you know the answer to this. Come on now. It's this guy right here. And normally I should clarify, I don't always have a full bottle of whiskey.
It's usually empty.
It's usually empty or half full, right?
but I've watched a few of these shows, so I knew what I had to do. But it's a Sagamore Spirit Rye. Yeah, so I'm located near Baltimore, and it's a Baltimore rye, which I think is amazing.
Very cool.
It's awesome.
We'll have to get some of that.
I
wonder if we know someone near the greater Baltimore area that could bring us up some at Christmas time.
Lots of people.
Like Jeff, that's going to be out for a Christmas show, or... Huh.
Hey, Anuj, I got a question for you. Do you know a guy named Virus, Carl Vincent?
Do I know someone from where?
Named Virus, Carl Vincent.
No, I don't think so.
I'll have to introduce you. We've been talking about Packers for years, and you would become a full-time alcoholic if you spent some time with him.
I think I already am. But yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, please do the intro.
Not a problem. Happy to. Tyler, what about you? Got anything for him?
No, you guys are always doing good stuff over BlackBerry, so appreciate it.
Tyler's retired.
Oh, thank you.
He's retired?
I don't know.
Pseudo retired. Awesome. When are you teaching next, Anuj? Tell us about your classes a little bit.
Oh, yeah. So, you did a great intro up front, but I'm a co-author, and I teach the 610 class, which is the kind of introductory, intermediate reverse engineering class at SANS. And about a year and a half ago, I debuted the 710. So I spent many years kind of creating that class, which is a follow-on to 610. So, yeah, it's called Advanced Code Analysis. I always get a little bit of grief for using the word advanced, but it's like to clarify, it's relative to 610. So it's the follow-on course. That's always kind of, I mean, the class is constantly going on there. I'm not teaching again for a few months, but I did the on-demand recording, so I guess I'm always there.
You are the voice. You are the voice of.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah. So and beyond that, I wanted to mention, definitely, if you have time, check out my YouTube channel. Maybe we can throw a link in the slow notes.
You said you're doing a YouTube channel now. Yeah, and your camera looks amazing, by the way. You got a nice camera.
Thanks.
Microphone, everything, and you're doing the YouTube thing.
Nice, at least. Yeah, I'm only 4 videos in, so I'm a YouTube baby, but I'm enjoying it so far, and would love thankful for the support I've gotten so far. And if you want to check out the goal there is to, within 10 or 15 minutes, ideally go through some sort of malware analysis tool or technique, just something kind of bite-sized. Maybe people can watch over lunch or something. And I've enjoyed creating videos so far, and hoping to keep that up at a cadence of probably every 2 or 3 weeks.
What's your YouTube?
Oh, it's just my name. Yeah, Anuj Soni.
Got it.
So it might be, if you go to the youtube.com, I think it might be my last name first, Soni Anuj.
Oh, okay. I gotcha. I think the link is in the show notes for that.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, we would definitely appreciate people checking it out. And of course, if there are things you want to see, definitely, I'm at the stage of my number of subscribers where I still read comments. I've been told by people who have many more subscribers than I do. But at this stage, so far, it's all been pretty good. I encourage people to leave a comment. Let me know if you want to see a particular topic to be covered. Always looking for ideas.
Sweet.
Yep, at Suni Anuj.
Yeah, I got it. I subscribed already.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm getting really good at taking photos of me pointing to nothing.
I like it. There are a lot of the audience. You pointing to stuff.
Yeah,
I'm
really
it.
good at pointing, man. Yeah.
And you have some good pointers on your YouTube channel.
And it's not just in
There's a lot of ways to interpret that. Yeah. I'll be here all night.
That's going to be my story. That's why I do it.
Anuj, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Oh, yeah, sure.
All righty.
He already knows because he's practiced. He's watched this a couple
That's
times.
right.
I know it. I know
I did watch a couple, I'll admit. So, but I.
You know what the question's going to be. All right. 3 words to describe yourself.
Slow and steady.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
This is the question I thought about the most. I decided it would be the 19-inch CRT monitor I had in college.
Oh, God.
Was it one of those Sun monitors? Because
I had one of those
are extra
too.
heavy.
Yeah.
No, I think it was a Dell, but it was big.
Wow.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
So the first title I came up with for this was R.E. Me, and I was like, it sounds cool, but means nothing. And then I came up with a better one, and it's called Unpacking Me.
I love it. I love it. What is your favorite hacker movie?
Oh, yeah. I was going to chime in on the initial pre-show discussion, but I thought I'd save it for now, just in case you hated me for it. So I'll say the movie, but then let me explain. So the movie is Black Hat, but the reason is not because it's so good. The reason is because it's so bad. And I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. It's the one with Chris Hemsworth. Has anyone seen it?
It's been a long time, but yes.
Yeah. So there's some clips in there where he's reverse engineering code. And there's one in particular that I'll never forget and is responsible for the selection, where he is looking at some malware, and he's literally reading the code or reading something. He throws it in a hex editor, and he's looking not even at the opcodes, the hexadecimal values, but he's looking at the ASCII representation of the code, and he's reading the code, or at least that's what he's talking through. He's like, look at this, look what it's doing. So I thought that was just an awful choice, and that's why it's my favorite movie.
That's awesome. Choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
All right, this one was the easiest because I have something on my desk, and that is this.
Superman.
Nice.
And I probably should go with Lois, but I'm going to go with Wonder Woman.
Okay, because I was going to ask, did Superman reproduce asexually, or because that's a thing, right? So Superman.
I don't think they covered that in the comics.
That was a great response, by the way.
Wow.
Oh.
I mean, I suppose anything's possible with Kryptonite.
It's true. Could be. Anuj, thank you so much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly.
Of course. Thank you all. Appreciate the discussion.
Thanks, Anuj.
Thanks, Anuj. Coming up next, the security news. Stay tuned.